In the sterile, high-stakes world of aviation, a pilot's career is built on two things: skill and trust. For First Officer Daniel Vance, a promotion to captain was the final step on his ascent to the top. The last hurdle was a routine evaluation flight with a new trainee, a young black woman he instantly dismissed as a token hire. He believed the 4 stripes on his shoulder were just a formality away. What he didn't know was that the woman in the right seat wasn't a trainee. She was his judge, his jury, and the architect of the most important test of his life, and he was failing with every condescending word and every ignored command. The office of Captain Richard Miller, Chief of Flight Operations for Transatlantic Air, was a shrine to aviation. Polished mahogany models of aircraft from the classic Boeing 707 to the modern 787 Dreamliner lined the shelves. Framed photos captured Miller shaking hands with industry legends and standing proudly before gleaming jets in exotic locales. But the atmosphere on this Tuesday morning was far from celebratory. It was tense, the air thick with outspoken gravity. Captain Maya Roberts sat opposite Miller's imposing desk, her posture a study in controlled composure. In her civilian clothes, a simple black blazer and grey trousers, she looked more like a corporate executive than one of the airline's most respected line check captains. Her gaze was steady fixed on the man who had personally requested this meeting. "I won't sugarcoat it." Maya Miller began, his voice a low rumble that commanded attention. He leaned forward, his hands clasped on a file. The nameplate on the file read, "Vance, Daniel T. First Officer, we have a problem. Dan Vance is on paper a perfect candidate for promotion to captain. His stick and rudder skills are flawless. His technical knowledge is encyclopedic. He aces every simulator check we throw at him." Maya nodded slowly, her expression unreadable. She knew there was a but coming. In her line of work, there always was. But Miller continued confirming her suspicion. "We're getting reports. Whispers mostly. Complaints that never make it to official HR channels because junior crew members are afraid of retaliation. The flight attendants call him Dan the Dictator. Junior first officers say he's dismissive, arrogant, and runs the cockpit like it's his personal kingdom. The common denominator in these informal complaints is, well, it's his attitude towards women and minority crew members." Maya's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. She had encountered pilots like Dan Vance before. They were relics of a bygone era, men who believed the cockpit was the exclusive domain of men who looked just like them. They were also a colossal safety risk. A cockpit crew that doesn't communicate, that doesn't foster mutual respect, is a compromised crew. "You want me to evaluate him," Maya stated. It wasn't a question. "I need you to," Miller corrected. "A standard line check won't work. He'll be on his best behavior with me or any of the other senior check pilots. He knows who we are. He knows what to say, how to act. But with a new face, someone he doesn't recognize. Someone he might underestimate." Miller let the sentence hang in the air, the implication clear. Maya understood the unstated part of the plan. She was not just a new face. She was a black woman. If Dan Vance had a prejudice problem, she was the perfect litmus test. It was a role she had played before, both officially and unofficially, throughout her career. The sting of being used as a yardstick for someone else's bigotry never fully went away. But she had learned to channel that frustration into a steely resolve. The safety of her future crews and their passengers depended on it. "What's the cover?" she asked, her voice calm and professional. "Flight 301, JFK to Heathrow. A 7-hour flight, plenty of time for his true colors to show. We've rostered you as a final stage trainee on a diversity fast-track program. Miller explained, a hint of distaste in his voice for the deception they were engineering. Your file will show you have the minimum required hours with excellent simulator scores, but 0 long-haul international experience. You'll be in the right-hand seat technically under his command as the acting pilot in command. The rostered captain, a senior man named Peterson, will conveniently call in sick an hour before the flight. Standard procedure dictates that Vance, as the senior first officer, will move to the left seat. He'll think he's in charge of a rookie. Maya processed the information. It was a solid plan. By placing her in a subordinate role, they were giving Vance all the rope he needed to either prove the rumors wrong or hang himself with it. He will see my name on the roster. Captain Maya Roberts. He might look me up. Miller shook his head. We've thought of that. For this flight, you are Maya Robinson. A common enough name to be untraceable in the company-wide system without a specific employee ID. Your temporary ID will flag you as a trainee. He won't dig any deeper. His ego won't let him. He'll see the designation trainee and the note about the diversity program, and his mind will be made up before you even shake his hand. A grim silence settled between them. They both knew the ugliness of the situation. They were weaponizing the very prejudice they sought to expunge. Maya Miller said, his voice softening. I know this is a lot to ask. It's unfair that you have to be the one to do this. But you are the best person for the job. You're objective, you're unflappable, and you command more respect than any pilot I know. This isn't just about Vance. It's about the culture of this airline. We can't have men like him in the left seat. Not now, not ever. Maya took a deep breath. The air in the polished office suddenly feeling thin. She thought of every young woman, every person of color she had mentored, who had come to her with stories of being dismissed, ignored, or harassed by pilots just like Dan Vance. She was not just doing this for Miller or for the airline. She was doing it for them. I'll do it, she said, her voice leaving no room for doubt. Where do I pick up my new identity? Miller slid a temporary ID card and a thin file across the desk. Welcome aboard, Trainee Robinson. Don't disappoint us. As Maya left the office, the file in her hand felt heavier than its meager weight. It contained the details of a flight, a route, and a man's career. She walked through the pristine halls of the corporate headquarters, her heels clicking with a steady, determined rhythm. She was Captain Maya Roberts, a seasoned veteran of the skies. But for the next 24 hours, she was a lamb being led into a lion's den. The lion, however, had no idea she had teeth of her own. The transatlantic aircrew lounge at JFK's Terminal 4 was a hive of controlled chaos. Pilots in crisp white shirts, adorned with epaulets and stripes, moved with an air of purpose, grabbing coffee and flight plans. Flight attendants gathered in small groups, their bright uniforms a splash of color against the muted gray decor. The energy was a familiar cocktail of anticipation and routine. Maya dressed in her pilot's uniform, but with the 3 stripes of a first officer on her shoulders, found a quiet corner to review the flight plan for Flight 301. Her temporary ID identifying her as Maya Robinson was clipped to her shirt pocket. She kept her head down, projecting the slight nervousness of a trainee, an act she found both demeaning and necessary. She heard his voice before she saw him. You've got to be kidding me. They're really scraping the bottom of the barrel now. The voice was loud, arrogant, and laced with theatrical disbelief. Maya looked up. A tall, sandy-haired man with the 4 stripes of a captain on his shoulders, stood by the dispatch counter holding a tablet. He was talking to another pilot, but his voice was pitched to carry. This had to be Dan Vance. He had been promoted to the left seat for this flight, and he was already wearing the authority like an ill-fitting suit. He turned, and his eyes swept the lounge before landing directly on her. He held her gaze for a moment too long, a smirk playing on his lips. He then walked over his stride, full of unearned confidence. "Maya Robinson?" he asked, though it sounded more like an accusation. "Yes," Maya said, standing to her feet and offering a professional, neutral expression. "First Officer Vance, I presume?" "It's Captain Vance for this leg." He corrected her instantly, his tone sharp. "Peterson called in sick. Looks like you and I are taking this bird across the pond. Lucky you." The condescension dripped from every word. He didn't offer to shake her hand. He looked her up and down, his eyes lingering for a moment on the 3 stripes on her epaulets, as if questioning their legitimacy. "I read your file," he said, tapping his tablet. "Diversity fast track. Impressive simulator scores. But the simulator doesn't bleed, and it doesn't have 300 souls in the back. Not a lot of real-world hours here, are there?" "I meet the requirements for the flight." "Captain." Maya replied, her voice even. She refused to let him see any flicker of irritation. Her role was to observe and evaluate, not to engage in a battle of egos. "Right. The requirements," he scoffed quietly, as if sharing a private joke with himself. "Look, Robinson, let's get something straight. I'm in charge up there. My cockpit, my rules. You do what I say when I say it. You speak when you're spoken to. You touch nothing unless I tell you to. Your job is to watch, learn, and try not to get in the way." Got it. The speech was so cartoonishly chauvinistic, it was almost comical. It was a textbook display of the exact behavior Miller had described. Any competent pilot knew that modern aviation was built on crew resource management, CRM, a philosophy that encouraged open communication, teamwork, and mutual respect regardless of rank. A captain who demanded silent obedience was a captain from the 1960s, and a dangerous one at that. "I understand the principles of CRM." Captain Vance Maya said, calmly, deliberately using the term she knew he was actively rejecting. "I'm here to support you and ensure a safe flight." His eyes narrowed. "Just call me Captain. And your support looks like you running the checklists when I tell you to and keeping the coffee coming. Now let's go. We've got a pre-flight to do." He turned and walked away without waiting for her, expecting her to follow like a puppy. Maya took a silent, centering breath. The test had begun, and Dan Vance was already failing spectacularly. During the walk to the gate, he continued his monologue, pointing out things on the tarmac, as if she'd never seen an airport before. "That's a fuel truck. They put the fuel in the wings. That big building is the hangar. That's where they fix the planes when they break." Maya simply nodded, her face a mask of polite interest. Inside, she was meticulously cataloguing every word, every gesture. Each condescending remark was another nail in the coffin of his career. When they reached the Boeing 777, waiting at the gate, he paused at the cockpit door. "All right, try to keep up. This is the flight deck. It's a little more complicated than the video games you're probably used to." They entered the cockpit, the heart of the magnificent machine. The array of screens, switches, and dials glowed in the dim light. It was a space Maya knew better than her own home. She had spent over 15,000 hours in cockpits just like this one. "You take the right seat," he ordered, throwing his flight bag into the left. "I'll handle the walk-around. You start the pre-flight checklist. Just read it off the screen. Don't touch anything, yet. As he left to conduct the exterior inspection, Maya settled into the first officer's seat. The worn leather felt familiar. She looked at the complex controls before her, the tools of her trade. Vance's assumption that she was an inexperienced novice was his first critical error. His second was believing that her silence was a sign of submission. He had no idea that her silence was the silence of a judge, carefully weighing the evidence before delivering a verdict. And the evidence was mounting fast. The takeoff from JFK was smooth, a powerful and graceful climb into the darkening twilight over the Atlantic. Below them, the lights of Long Island dwindled into a glittering carpet. As the Boeing 707 reached its initial cruising altitude of 37,000 feet, the workload in the cockpit eased and the long, monotonous hours of the transatlantic crossing began. This was the phase of the flight where cockpit dynamics truly revealed themselves. It was a time for quiet conversation, for building camaraderie for the two pilots to operate as a seamless team. For Dan Vance, it was an opportunity to assert his dominance. "Okay, Robinson," he said, leaning back in his seat and putting his feet up on the dashboard, a breach of professional etiquette. "Let's talk about your career path. This diversity program, is it as easy as it sounds? They just hand you the keys to a multi-million-dollar jet. Because you tick a box." Maya kept her eyes on the instruments, her hands resting lightly on her knees. "It's a program designed to broaden the talent pool, Captain. The standards are the same for everyone." "Sure they are," he snorted. "I had to work my tail off for 15 years to get to this seat. Scratch and claw for every flight hour. Guys like me, we earn it. It's not just handed to us." The irony was staggering. He was a white man in one of the least diverse professions in the country, complaining about a system designed to give others a fraction of the opportunities he had likely taken for granted. Maya's own journey had been a steep uphill climb against headwinds of prejudice and doubt, a reality he couldn't even begin to comprehend. "I'm sure you worked very hard for your position," she said, her voice betraying no emotion. An hour later, a message blinked on their screen from Oceanic Control, assigning them a new radio frequency. It was Maya's turn to handle communications. "Transatlantic 301 contact Gander on 128.45. She read back to confirm. She reached for the radio panel. "I'll handle it." Dan snapped, slapping her hand away from the dial. His touch was aggressive and unwarranted. "You'll probably punch in the wrong frequency and have us talking to a fishing boat in Newfoundland." He tuned the radio himself, his movements unnecessarily rough. It was a flagrant violation of protocol. The pilot designated as pilot monitoring is supposed to handle communications to reduce the workload on the pilot flying. By taking over a simple task, Dan was not only insulting her, but also disrupting the carefully balanced workflow of the cockpit. Maya made a sharp mental note. Interference with crew duties, unprofessional physical contact. Later, as they flew into the vast, dark emptiness over the ocean, Maya's weather radar began to paint a picture of developing convective activity 100 miles ahead. It wasn't a thunderstorm yet, but it was a cluster of turbulent air that could easily be avoided with a minor course deviation. "Captain, I'm seeing some weather building on our flight path," she said, pointing to the green and yellow patches on her navigation display. "I recommend a deviation of 10 degrees to the south for about 50 miles to stay clear of the worst of it." It was a standard, prudent suggestion. Passenger comfort and safety were paramount. A slight detour was far preferable to a bone-rattling ride through turbulence. Dan glanced at his own screen, then back at hers, a dismissive sneer on his face. "That's nothing. Just a few clouds. You new pilots are always spooked by a little green on the screen. We'll punch right through it. They need to learn how to handle a little chop. My concern is for passenger comfort and the cabin crew," Captain Meyer insisted gently. "A small deviation now could prevent a lot of issues later. Your concern is noted and ignored." "Robinson," he said flatly. "I'm the captain on this flight. We are not deviating. Is that clear? We will maintain our present course and heading." His refusal was not based on fuel calculations, weather analysis, or operational requirements. It was based purely on ego. He had been challenged, however politely, by the person he considered his inferior, and he couldn't tolerate it. He would rather fly his 300 passengers through uncomfortable, bumpy air than accept a valid suggestion from a diversity hire trainee. As predicted, 30 minutes later, the aircraft hit the turbulence. It started as a light chop and quickly escalated. The 777 began to buck and shudder, and in the cabin, the seatbelt sign chimed on with a loud ding. A call came from Sarah, the lead flight attendant. "Flight deck cabin here. It's getting pretty rough back here. We had to suspend service. Just had a drink cart almost tip over. Are we expecting this to last long?" Her voice was strained. Dan grabbed the receiver. "Just a little weather, Sarah. Tell everyone to sit down and relax. We'll be through it in a few minutes." He hung up and shot a glare at Maya. "See? A few bumps. Nothing to get your panties in a twist about." Maya remained silent, her jaw set. He had needlessly endangered the cabin crew and distressed the passengers to make a petty point. He hadn't just ignored her input. He had gambled with the well-being of everyone on board to satisfy his own arrogance. This was no longer just about prejudice. This was about airmanship, and Dan Vance had just demonstrated that he possessed none. The file she was building in her mind grew thicker, its contents more damning with every passing mile. 3 hours from London, somewhere over the dark, frigid waters of the North Atlantic, a single amber light illuminated on the overhead panel. It was accompanied by a soft advisory chime that cut through the low hum of the cockpit. Fuel imbalance. The light was not a dire warning of an immediate emergency, but it was a significant anomaly that demanded careful and correct action. It indicated that the fuel tanks in the wings were not draining at the same rate, causing one wing to be heavier than the other. If left uncorrected, it could affect the aircraft's stability and performance. Dan Vance swore under his breath, leaning forward to stare at the light as if his glare could extinguish it. Maya, the pilot. Monitoring immediately began the standard procedure. "Fuel imbalance caution light," she announced in a clear, calm voice. "Checklist, please." She brought up the electronic checklist on her display screen. The procedure was straightforward. Verify the fuel quantities in each tank, check the position of the cross-feed valves, and if necessary, open the cross-feed and turn off the fuel pumps for the heavier tank to allow the engines to draw fuel from it, balancing the load. "I see it. I don't need you to read it to me." Dan snapped, his irritation palpable. He was clearly flustered. An anomaly on his watch on his evaluation flight, or what he thought was just a flight with a trainee, was a blot on his perfect record. Maya continued calmly, pointing to the fuel gauges on the center display. Left wing tank at 18.2 thousand kilograms, right wing tank at 19.5. The imbalance is approximately 1,300 kilograms. "I can do the math." "Robinson," he said, his voice tight. He slapped the overhead panel, turning off the fuel pumps for the right wing tank. It was a premature action, a step taken out of sequence. The checklist called for opening the crossfeed valve first to ensure fuel could flow from the heavier tank before shutting off its pumps. Captain, the checklist calls for opening the crossfeed valve before shutting down the pumps. Maya stated her tone carefully neutral. She was not accusing. She was reminding. She was being a good co-pilot. Dan's head whipped around, his face flushed with anger. Are you questioning my actions? I've been flying this aircraft for 10 years. I know this system inside and out. I'm creating a deliberate suction feed. It's a technique, not something they teach you in your little diversity classes. There was no such technique. It was a fabrication, a pathetic attempt to cover up a mistake made in haste. By not opening the crossfeed valve, all he had done was starve the right engine of fuel from its own tank without providing it a new source. While the engine would continue to run, drawing from a collector tank for a short while, it was a reckless and non-standard procedure that put unnecessary strain on the system. Captain, with respect, Maya pressed her voice firmer now. This was a critical moment. He was actively creating a more dangerous situation. The correct and safe procedure is to open the crossfeed. We need to follow the manufacturer's approved checklist. The last thing I need is a lecture from a trainee, he snarled. I am the captain. We are going to do this my way. Now be quiet and let me work. He was staring intently at the fuel gauges as if willing the numbers to change faster, but his incorrect procedure was having a negligible effect. The imbalance was barely decreasing. His ego was now in a direct battle with the laws of physics, and physics was winning. Maya made a decision. This had crossed the line from poor judgment to active endangerment. Her primary duty above all else was to the safety of the flight. The evaluation was secondary to that. She reached up, her movements deliberate and precise, and flipped the switch for the cross-feed valve to the open position. Then she turned the fuel pumps for the right tank back on, and then off again, resetting the system to the correct configuration as dictated by the checklist. Dan stared at her, his mouth agape in disbelief. What do you think you're doing? I gave you a direct order. He roared, his voice echoing in the small cockpit. I am taking action to ensure the safety of this aircraft. Maya said, her voice now devoid of any warmth. It was cold, hard, and resonant, with an authority he had never heard from her before. Your technique was not working and was contrary to standard operating procedure. We will now follow the checklist. As the pilot monitoring it is my duty to intervene if I see an action that compromises safety. For the first time, a flicker of uncertainty appeared in Dan's eyes. Her sudden shift in demeanor, the absolute confidence in her actions, had thrown him off. He was looking at her as if seeing her for the first time. The meek trainee was gone. In her place was a pilot who was utterly in command of the situation and of herself. He opened his mouth to argue, then closed it. He looked at the fuel gauges. The numbers for the right tank were now steadily decreasing, while the left remained stable. The system was balancing exactly as the checklist predicted it would. He had been wrong. She had been right. And she had defied him to do it. The rest of the cockpit fell into a thick, suffocating silence. Dan Vance did not say another word for nearly an hour. He just stared ahead into the darkness, the glow of the instruments illuminating a face that was a mask of fury and humiliation. He had lost control of the cockpit, and he knew it. The amber fuel imbalance. Light eventually extinguished, but the damage was done. Maya had logged his most critical failure yet, a willful disregard for safety procedures born from pure, unadulterated arrogance. The first hint of dawn was a faint, bruised purple line on the eastern horizon as Flight 301 began its descent towards London. The tension in the cockpit had solidified into a thick, unbreachable wall. Dan Vance had been broodingly silent ever since the fuel imbalance incident, communicating only in clipped monosyllabic commands required for the operation of the aircraft. He refused to make eye contact with Maya. As they were handed off from one air traffic controller to another, guiding them on their final approach path into Heathrow, Maya performed her duties with flawless precision. She handled the radios, managed the aircraft's descent profile, and configured the flaps and landing gear exactly as required. Her every action was a quiet testament to her competence, a competence that Dan could no longer deny, though his pride would never let him admit it. Sarah, the lead flight attendant, entered the cockpit to give her pre-landing report. "Cabin is secure for landing, Captain," she said, her professional smile not quite reaching her eyes. She glanced from Dan's stony face to Maya's calm demeanor. She had been on enough flights to recognize a toxic cockpit atmosphere. "Thanks, Sarah," Maya replied warmly, giving her a brief, reassuring nod. Dan ignored the flight attendant, completely staring out the window as if she wasn't there. Sarah hesitated for a moment, then looked at Maya and mouthed the words, "Are you okay?" Maya gave a subtle, almost imperceptible nod. The small gesture of solidarity was not lost on her. Sarah had seen it. She had seen the dismissiveness, the hostility. It was another piece of corroborating evidence. After Sarah left, Dan finally spoke, his voice dripping with venom. "Don't think that little stunt you pulled back there makes you some kind of hero. You broke the chain of command. You were insubordinate. When we land, I'm writing you up. You'll be lucky if you're ever allowed back in a cockpit again." Maya simply looked at him. She didn't argue. She didn't defend herself. She just held his gaze with a look of profound, unshakable calm. It was this unnerving placidity that seemed to infuriate him the most. He was used to people reacting to him with fear, with anger, with submission. Her refusal to give him any emotional response was a denial of his power. The landing at Heathrow was perfect. Dan, for all his faults, was a technically skilled pilot. He guided the 777 onto the runway with a surgeon's precision. But a pilot is more than just a pair of hands. A captain is a leader, a communicator, a manager of risk. In every one of those crucial roles, Dan had failed. As they taxied to the gate, he made his final, most condescending remark of the flight. It was a parting shot, designed to be the last word, the final assertion of his superiority. "You know, Robinson," he said, not looking at her as he expertly navigated the taxiways, "I get what you were trying to do. You wanted to impress me, show some initiative. But you have to learn your place. Don't worry, you'll get the hang of it eventually. Not everyone is cut out for this kind of pressure. Maybe you can find a nice regional airline flying short hops. That might be more your speed." He brought the aircraft to a gentle stop at the gate and began the shutdown sequence. He was smug, confident that he had put the uppity trainee in her place. He believed he was walking away from this flight, the victor ready to write a scathing report that would end her career before it had even begun. Maya watched him, a sliver of pity piercing through her professional detachment. He had no idea what was coming. He was a man walking confidently towards a cliff edge in the fog, utterly oblivious to the abyss that awaited him. "Thank you for the flight, Captain Vance." Maya said, her voice even and polite as she unbuckled her seatbelt. "Don't thank me yet," he muttered. "You haven't read my report." She gathered her small flight bag. "I'm sure it will be very detailed," she said. "I know mine will be." She left the cockpit without a backward glance, leaving him alone with the silent screens and his own monumental ego. The flight was over, but the true reckoning was about to begin. The Transatlantic Air Operations Office at Heathrow was a functional, unglamorous space that smelled of stale coffee and jet fuel. It was a place for pilots to file paperwork, check schedules, and decompress after a long flight. Dan Vance strode into the briefing room with a sense of purpose. He had already mentally composed the damning report against Maya Robinson, painting her as an insubordinate and reckless trainee who had endangered the flight. He was looking forward to typing it up and personally handing it to the station's chief pilot. He pushed open the door to a small conference room designated for post-flight debriefs. He stopped dead in his tracks. Sitting at the head of the table was David Chen, the airline's chief pilot for the entire European sector. On a large monitor screen, patched in via a crystal-clear video link from New York, was Captain Richard Miller, the chief of flight operations for the entire airline. And sitting calmly at the table, a tablet in front of her, was the woman he knew as Maya Robinson. A cold dread, sharp and unfamiliar, began to creep up Dan's spine. This was not a standard debrief. This was an ambush. "First Officer Vance, please have a seat." Captain Miller's voice boomed from the speakers. It was not a request. Dan numbly walked to the empty chair opposite Maya and sat down. His mind was racing, trying to make sense of the scene. Why were the two most powerful pilots in the company? Here Dan Miller began his face on the screen, a grim mask. "We're here to discuss your performance on Flight 301. Specifically, your suitability for command." Dan's heart hammered against his ribs. "Sir, there was an incident. The trainee Robinson. She was insubordinate. She interfered with a checklist. Allow me to stop you right there." Mr. Vance Miller cut in his voice like ice. "First, I'd like to introduce you properly. The woman you know as Maya Robinson is in fact Captain Maya Roberts. She is one of our most senior line check captains with over 15,000 flight hours, a spotless safety record, and she is the lead instructor on the Boeing 737. For this flight, she was your evaluator." The words hit Dan like a physical blow. He swiveled his head to look at Maya. The meek trainee was gone. The woman sitting across from him now radiated an aura of quiet, unshakable authority. The 3 stripes on her epaulets suddenly seemed like a mockery. In her eyes he saw not anger, but a profound and final judgment. His face went pale, the blood draining from it, so fast he felt lightheaded. Captain Roberts Miller prompted from the screen. "Your report." Maya tapped her tablet, and her voice, the same calm, even voice he had dismissed and ridiculed for 7 hours, filled the silent room. She began to recount the flight, not with emotion or accusation, but with the cold, hard precision of an accident investigator. "The evaluation began prior to boarding at JFK," she started. In the crew lounge, First Officer Vance loudly referred to the diversity initiative as scraping the bottom of the barrel. Upon introduction, he adopted a condescending tone, referring to me as Robinson, while insisting on being called Captain. He explicitly stated his cockpit rules were that I should speak when spoken to and try not to get in the way, a direct contravention of all established crew resource management principles. Dan began to sweat. He could hear his own words being read back to him, stripped of their context and laid bare as pure unprofessional arrogance. Maya continued, her voice relentless. During the flight, he dismissed a standard weather deviation suggestion, resulting in a prolonged period of moderate turbulence that caused disruption in the cabin and distress to the passengers. He physically knocked my hand away from the radio controls, assuming I was incompetent to change a frequency. His conduct was consistently dismissive and created a hostile command and control environment rather than a collaborative one. She paused, her eyes meeting Dan's for a fleeting moment. The most significant event, she went on, was the handling of the fuel imbalance caution. First Officer Vance failed to follow the approved electronic checklist. He skipped a critical step, opening the crossfeed valve, and when I advised him of the correct procedure, he became hostile, invented a non-existent technique to cover his error, and gave me a direct order to remain silent. His actions failed to correct the anomaly and constituted a willful disregard for standard operating procedure. I was forced to intervene and take corrective action to ensure the safety of the flight. Every word was a nail in his coffin. She recited times, altitudes, and specific quotes. It was a flawless, devastating takedown. When she finished, a heavy silence descended on the room. Dan couldn't speak. He couldn't breathe. The entire flight replayed in his mind, but this time through the lens of the truth. Every smirk, every condescending remark, every dismissal had been recorded by the very person he thought was beneath his notice. Captain Miller's face on the screen was grim. Vance, the position of captain at this airline is one of ultimate trust. We don't just trust you with a $200 million aircraft. We trust you with the lives of every soul on board. That trust is built on judgment, professionalism, and teamwork. Today you have shown a catastrophic failure in all three areas. Your technical skills mean nothing when your ego is a liability at 37,000 feet. David Chen. The European chief pilot, who had been silent until now, spoke for the first time. His voice was quiet, but carried immense weight. Your attitude towards a fellow crew member, regardless of their perceived rank, was appalling. There is no place for that kind of prejudice in any cockpit at this airline. Full stop. Dan Vance finally found his voice, but it was a weak, desperate rasp. I didn't know. If I had known who she was... That's the entire point, Captain Miller interrupted, his voice laced with profound disappointment. It shouldn't matter who she is. Whether she is a 10,000-hour captain or a 10-hour trainee, she is a member of your crew, and you treat her with respect. You failed the test, not because you disrespected a senior captain, but because you disrespected another human being you thought you had power over. Your promotion to captain is denied. Effective immediately, you are on administrative leave, pending a full and formal review of your conduct. You will be flown home as a passenger. You are not to enter the cockpit of a transatlantic air aircraft again until this investigation is complete. The verdict was delivered. Dan Vance slumped in his chair, a broken man. The 4 stripes he had so proudly worn into this room now felt like a costume. He had flown so high only to be brought crashing down to earth by his own blind arrogance. The woman he had ignored, the trainee he had tried to humiliate, had been holding his entire career in her hands all along, and he had handed her all the evidence she needed to crush it. The fallout from Dan Vance's failed evaluation was swift and decisive. The internal investigation, bolstered by Captain Roberts's meticulous report and a corroborating statement from Sarah, the lead flight attendant, was an open and shut case. Within 2 weeks, Daniel Vance was terminated from Transatlantic Air. The official reason was a pattern of unprofessional conduct and a failure to adhere to safety protocols. Unofficially, everyone knew the truth. His career as a commercial pilot was over. No reputable airline would touch a pilot fired for such a flagrant breach of crew resource management. The karma was absolute. His ego had written a check his skills could not cash. For Maya Roberts, life returned to normal, or what passed for normal, in her demanding profession. The undercover flight was just another entry in her logbook, but its impact resonated. The story of Captain Vance's final flight spread through the pilot community like wildfire. It became a cautionary tale, a stark reminder that character, not just technical prowess, was what made a true captain. 3 months later, Maya was conducting a routine line check on a different flight, this time from London to Miami. Her co-pilot was a young, sharp first officer named Tom Bennett. He was competent, respectful, and embodied the principles of teamwork. As they soared over the Atlantic, the same vast expanse of ocean where she had evaluated Dan Vance, Tom turned to her. "Captain," he said, his tone one of genuine curiosity. "Is it true what they say about that guy Vance, the one who got fired?" Maya looked over at him. What is it they're saying, that he was tested by an undercover Czech pilot who he thought was a trainee? That he treated her horribly because she was a woman of color on a diversity program? Maya held his gaze. "What's important, Tom, is that a pilot who was a risk to his crews and passengers is no longer flying. A cockpit has to be a place of absolute trust and communication. There's no room for ego or prejudice up here. It compromises safety." Tom nodded, his expression serious. "I agree completely. I wanted to say on behalf of all the junior guys who heard stories about him, thank you for upholding the standard. It makes us feel safer knowing that the system works, that people like him are weeded out." His words struck a chord deep within her. It was the reason she accepted these difficult assignments. It wasn't about punishing one man. It was about protecting the integrity of the entire profession. It was for the countless good pilots like Tom, for dedicated flight attendants like Sarah, and for the millions of passengers who placed their lives in their hands every day. She gave him a small, genuine smile. "We all have a role to play in upholding the standard, Tom. You're doing a great job." He beamed at the praise, his confidence visibly boosted. They continued the flight, working together as a seamless team. A perfect example of how a professional cockpit should operate. Looking out at the endless blue horizon where the sky met the sea, Maya felt a sense of profound peace. The sky was a great equalizer. It didn't care about your gender, your race, or your background. It only cared about your skill, your judgment, and your respect for its power. She had dedicated her life to honoring that principle, and today, soaring high above the clouds, she knew she was exactly where she was meant to be, a guardian of the skies, ensuring that only the worthy were allowed to command them. Her work was not just a job. It was a calling, and the horizon ahead was clear and full of promise. 1 year later, the world had moved on. For Captain Maya Roberts, the sky remained a familiar and welcoming office. For Daniel Vance, it had become a painted ceiling he could no longer reach. His termination from transatlantic air had been the aviation equivalent of a black mark, a permanent stain that no amount of scrubbing could remove. His appeals were denied. His union support evaporated once the details of his conduct became clear, and his reputation preceded him to every other major airline. The doors to the cockpit, once wide open, were now sealed shut. The man who had once commanded a Boeing 777 now worked in a cramped, windowless office in a dreary industrial park near a regional airport. He was a flight dispatcher for a small, struggling cargo airline that flew aging turboprops on overnight runs. The glamour was gone, replaced by the drone of a failing air conditioner and the smell of microwaved fish. His uniform was no longer a crisp white shirt with gold-braided epaulets, but a faded blue polo shirt with the company's peeling logo. The 4 stripes that had been the pinnacle of his identity were a phantom limb, an ache of something amputated. Bitterness was the fuel that got him through the day. In the long, lonely hours of the night, tracking a shipment of machine parts flying through a thunderstorm over Ohio, he would replay Flight 301 in his mind. But in his version of events, he was the victim. He had been entrapped, a target of a political agenda. Maya Roberts wasn't an evaluator. She was an executioner sent by a woke corporation to make an example of a good old-fashioned pilot. He never once considered that his own actions, his own words, were the cause of his downfall. The arrogance that had cost him his career was the same arrogance that prevented him from learning a single lesson from it. One Tuesday afternoon, his boss called him in. A critical part for a grounded aircraft needed to be hand-delivered to a maintenance crew at JFK. All their regular couriers were tied up. "Vance, you know your way around JFK, right?" his boss asked, not looking up from a greasy invoice. "Take the part. Get it to Hangar 17, the transatlantic maintenance hangar." The name of his old airline hit him like a physical shock. "Go back there." To the place where he was once a demigod, now reduced to a delivery boy. The humiliation was a thick bile-like taste in his throat. But he needed the job. He needed the meager paycheck that barely covered the rent on his small apartment. "Fine," he mumbled, taking the small, heavy box. Driving to JFK was a journey through a past life. He saw the familiar approach lights, the tails of wide-bodied jets glinting in the sun. He parked in the public garage, a place he'd only ever used as a passenger, and walked towards the terminal. The automatic doors slid open, and the familiar sounds and smells washed over him. Jet fuel floor polish, the babble of a dozen languages, the rhythmic clatter of rolling suitcases. He saw pilots from every airline walking with purpose, their confident strides a painful reminder of everything he had lost. His destination was on the air side of the terminal, so he had to go to the security office to get a temporary escort pass. As he stood in line, a transatlantic air crew walked past. The captain, a man he vaguely recognized, nodded at him politely, the way one nods at a stranger, a member of the public. The invisibility was a torment. He was a ghost haunting his own past. After getting his pass, he made his way through the bustling terminal towards the secure doors that led to the tarmac. And that's when he saw her. Captain Maya Roberts was standing near the gate for the evening flight to Paris, speaking with her flight crew. She was in her full uniform, the 4 stripes of her command gleaming under the terminal lights. She was laughing at something the lead flight attendant said, her face relaxed and confident. She looked like she belonged there, an integral part of this complex, powerful world. To Dan, she looked like a queen surveying her kingdom, the kingdom he had been exiled from. A hot, uncontrollable rage surged through him. All his failures, all his humiliations of the past year coalesced into a single point of focus, her. In his warped mind, she was the sole architect of his misery. He started walking towards her, the box with the aircraft part clutched in his hand like a weapon. "Roberts," he said. His voice was a harsh, guttural sound he barely recognized. The flight crew turned. Maya's smile faded as she looked at him, her expression shifting to one of neutral recognition. There was no fear, no surprise. Just a calm, steady gaze. "Mr. Vance," she said, her tone professional. "Don't you Mr. Vance me." He snarled, his voice low but vibrating with fury. People in the crowded gate area started to notice their conversations quieting. "You ruined my life. You and your little diversity trap. Are you proud of yourself? Destroying a man's career for your own agenda." Maya's crew looked on, ready to intervene, but she gave them a subtle shake of her head. She took a step forward, creating a small pocket of space between them and the others. "My only agenda then and now is the safety of my aircraft and my crew," she said, her voice quiet but firm, cutting through his anger. "Your career was a casualty of your own conduct. My conduct." He scoffed, a wild look in his eyes. "I was a damn good pilot. Better than you'll ever be. I made one small mistake with a fuel pump. This was never about your ability to fly an airplane." "Dan," she said, using his first name for the first time. The sound of it from her lips was strangely intimate and utterly devastating. A pilot who is blinded by prejudice is a compromised pilot. A pilot who bullies his co-pilot is a compromised pilot. A pilot whose ego is more important than the checklist is a danger to everyone. The flight you and I took wasn't a test of your skills, it was a test of your character, and you failed." Her words were not an attack. They were a diagnosis delivered with the detached precision of a surgeon, and for the first time a sliver of the truth pierced through the armor of his denial. He looked at her calm authority, the respect she commanded from her crew, the utter rightness of her presence here. And then he thought of his own miserable existence, his lonely office, the faded polo shirt. The chasm between them was not one of luck or politics. It was a chasm of character. He had no response. The anger that had propelled him across the terminal floor deflated, leaving behind a hollow, crushing emptiness. He was a ghost, and she was the solid, living proof of the world he had forfeited. "I have a flight to command," Maya said, her voice softening, almost imperceptibly, with something that might have been pity. She gave him a final brief nod, then turned and walked away, her crew falling into step beside her as they headed for the jet bridge. Dan Vance stood alone in the middle of the crowded terminal, the box in his hand, suddenly feeling impossibly heavy. The bustling crowd swirled around him, an anonymous man in a place where he once had a name. He watched the woman he had underestimated, the woman he had dismissed, disappear from view, to go and conquer the sky, leaving him grounded in the wreckage of his own making. That flight was a brutal but necessary lesson. It's a stark reminder that in any profession, whether you're a pilot at 37,000 feet or a manager in an office, true leadership isn't about power or authority. It's about respect. It's about recognizing the value in every single person on your team, regardless of their rank, their background, their gender, or the color of their skin. Dan Vance's arrogance blinded him to the fact that the person he disrespected the most was the one who held his future in her hands. He learned the hard way that karma isn't just a concept, it's a reckoning. The story serves as a powerful testament that character is the ultimate qualification, and sooner or later, we are all tested. What did you think of Dan's immediate karma? Have you ever witnessed someone's prejudice come back to haunt them so spectacularly? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button. Share it with someone who needs to hear it, and make sure you subscribe for more real-life stories of drama and justice. Thank you for listening.